this morning and in her role as advisory board member of the Humanities Center. Is also Associate Professor of English and Women's Studies at Wayne State University. She is the author of Elizabeth Bowen, of Reputation in Writing and Lesbian Configurations. Her areas of interest are visual culture, postmodern theory, and 20th century literature. And she is speaking today on the subject of subverting the subject, billed on as ethico-aesthetic praxis.
Thank you, Ruth. When I wrote up this rather grandiose title, I didn't realize it actually contains a pun. Rather than the death of building, I will subvert the subject of building, hopefully, a little bit. In these postmodern times, or indeed hypermodern times, the concept of building in its 18th and 19th German idealist sense would seem no longer to make sense at all. The classical ideals of wholeness, unity, universality, and self-transcendence do neither jive with the decentered, multiple, discursively constructed subject of post-structuralist thought, nor with the liberal democratic notions of identity, individualism, pluralism, and multiculturalism. Yet, in order to think the possibility of ethical becoming and to consider the constitution of the I within the we, beyond the subjugating forces of disciplinary or, in Deleuzian terms, controlling institutions such as colleges and universities, as much as beyond the parameters of quantifiable forms of knowledge or competencies, some concept of building, or perhaps neo-building, appears to be required. Taking aesthetic experience as my starting point, what I wish to do in this paper is to share some thoughts by the contemporary notion of building as a desubjectating process, as a subversive force of transformation that takes the subject outside of itself, a deterritorializing force that transgresses the borders of experience and enacts a non-transparency of self that nonetheless renders the subject into a person. In the light of both larger trends, in the recent history of the world, for instance, globalization, technologization, multiculturalization, and more local disruptions of established socio-historical and political landscapes, including what I've earlier called the economical educational ecosphere, my interest in building in the first place concerns its relation to ethics. Recent outcries against the worldwide crisis in education, apparent from, if not directly caused, by, among other things, the corporatization, can't even say that word, of colleges and universities, massive budget cuts, the adjunctification of the faculty, the neglect of the liberal arts and the humanities, the watering down of academic standards, clear from certifiable grade inflation and ambivalent responses to rampant practices of plagiarism, the obsession with test and citation scores, the imperative for faculty to acquire grants externally or internally, even if they don't actually need them, and to keep up ever more ambitious publication records, even though they have nothing much new to say, usually point to the dangers to democracy posed by the reduction of universities to economically profitable knowledge factories, as well as to the severe political consequences of the transformation of education into a process for the pragmatic reduction of knowledge per se. Rather than merely worrisome for the sustainability of the so-called new knowledge society itself, after all, the unpredictability and insecurity of the labor market render the preparation of graduates for particular forms of employment, the reduction of graduate education to vocational training, a particularly hazardous undertaking. The education for profit model also obscures the fact that universities have always served the needs of society, but that those needs go beyond economic success or technological advance, needs that I propose to define as ethical. It will be clear that in this, our so-called post-humanist age, the notion of ethics I'm evoking here has little to do with traditional frameworks of conventional morality. Instead, I conceive of ethics as an activity or an actualization of possibilities, an opening to the world that moves beyond the boundaries of our experience as subjects, beyond the boundaries of what we already know or think we know about ourselves as much as about the world and the others within it. Such an ethics concerns both the praxis and the principle, a process of formulation and self-questioning that continually re-articulates boundaries, norms, selves, and others. In positing Bildung as central to such an ethical project, which, rather than serving as the ideal of social self-affirmation and self-determination of the modern sovereign and knowing subject, takes the subject outside of itself, as it were, urging it to strive toward what Nietzsche calls, quote, the enlightened ether of subject-free contemplation, end quote. I attribute crucial significance to art and literature. To put it more clearly, underlying my reflections upon Bildung as a subversion of the subject is the presupposition that the potential for ethical modes of becoming critically lies, although it need not be restricted to, in aesthetic experience and or activity, as alternative modes of relating to the world, and also, not coincidentally, of major concern to the liberal arts and humanities. The concept of subjectivity, or rather of processes of subjectivation on which I base these claims, is centrally informed by the ideas of the French philosopher Félix Guattari, especially by the ethico-aesthetic paradigm developed in his last two solo works, the 1989 essay The Three Ecologies, and a concise study published shortly after his death in 1992, The Osmosis. My reasons for turning to Guattari, rather than say Nietzsche or Adorno, who have written both explicitly about Bildung, are twofold. First, Guattari, in addition to being a philosopher, ecologist, social theorist, and radical activist, was also significantly a psychoanalyst. His prime focus being the innovative psychiatric clinic at La Bourbe, which he established and where he worked until his death. He may have been an anti-Lacanian and to a lesser extent an anti-Freudian. Guattari's thought nonetheless remains thoroughly psychoanalytical, or perhaps more precisely, schizoanalytical. This is not only of crucial significance for the elaboration of his ethico-aesthetic paradigm, as will become clear shortly. It also entails, and this brings me to my second reason for focusing on Guattari, that rather than being merely concerned with devising concepts for the objective world, as a psychoanalyst, Guattari is intensely concerned with the subjective aspects of large-scale structures and machines, or with, quote, the relationship between subjectivity and its exteriority, be it social, animal, vegetable, or cosmic, end quote. And it is, as I will argue, only when we take into account the complexity and heterogeneity of processes of subjectivation within and in relation to its equally complex and heterogeneous exteriority that we may, on the one hand, clarify the ethical-political implications of, quote, the lost soul of higher education, to cite the title of Ellen Schrecker's recent book on the corporatization, the assault on academic freedom, and the end of the American university. That's the subtitle of the book. And on the other, explore the possibilities for Bildung as an ethical praxis aimed at the subversion of the subject. In the deceptively short essay, The Three Ecologies, Guattari begins with an incisive account of the world in its current ecological crisis, in order to argue that we may only be able to bring about enduring changes in our social, cultural, and natural environment by adopting what he calls an ecosophical perspective. That is to say, start from a model of thought that can offer an ethical political articulation of the problems facing the world in which the three ecological registers, which he defines as the environment, social relations, and human subjectivity, are thoroughly integrated. Rather than seeing any viability in creating a new unequivocal ideology, Guattari's purpose is to explore possibilities for new forms of human praxis in all kinds of domains, individual and collective, in everyday life, as well as in the larger political arena. Ultimately, he maintains, and I quote, the ecosophic problematic is that of the production of human existence itself in new historical context, end quote. In seeking to forge new paradigms of existence that are ethico-aesthetic rather than purely technocratic in nature, Guattari emphatically distances himself from those trends in the human and social sciences that claim primacy for structures or systems, since all modes of thought based on pseudo-scientific paradigms are bound to miss what he believes to be the most important processes of subjectivation, that is to say, quote, their intrinsically progressive, creative, and auto-positioning dimensions, end quote. The process of self-creation forms a critical aspect of the more fully developed transversalist model of subjectivity unfolded in the opening chapter of his subsequent work, Osmosis. In order to do justice to both the more private, interpersonal, familial, educational components of subjectivity, and to what he calls the machinic dimensions of reality, that is to say, the manifold ecological, economic, and technoscientific developments that continually destabilize our mental coordinates, including such archaic structures as neo-nationalism and religious fundamentalism, as well as the simultaneous forces of postmodern information and communication technologies. I'm very tired, it's been a long day. Guattari argues for a multi-componential cartographic approach to cover the entire range of complexes of subjectivation. In addition to those already mentioned, this would also include the earliest pre-verbal subjective formations that result from the effective exchanges qualifying infantile experience. Rather than self-contained universal stages of development, Guattari maintains, these primordial aspects constitute enduring levels of subjectivation, which increasingly link up with other semiological components to engender continuously newly configured modes of being. Although he refuses to privilege any of its variegated components, Guattari insists that it is from these earliest pre-verbal intensities that the heterogeneity of subjectivity can develop. At the same time, however, and despite his equal emphasis on the interpersonal, social, and collective aspects of subjectivation, he posits that the creative moment of the self lies in the transpersonal domains of large-scale social machines such as language and the mass media, as well as, quote, the incorporeal universes of reference as those relative to music and art, unquote. With this dual emphasis, Guattari appears to suggest that the most creative aspects of subjectivity emerge from the linkages between incorporeal semiotic elements and the enduring affective formations produced in the interaction between the pre-verbal self and its significant others. In conjunction with his highlighting of the practical and social nature of subjectivation, his model, to whose complexity I can by no means do justice here, would appear to bring the structuring role of art and literature in processes of becoming, and hence also of potential unbecoming, quite clearly into view. As a specific way of relating to the world, a different form of knowing that escapes cognition or rationality, the effects of art and literature, or aesthetic experience generally, ultimately obtain on the level of affect, on the most profound levels of perception and sensation associated with embodied experience, both within and beyond representation and signification. Guattari, we've seen, argues that the earliest pre-verbal formations of the self do not, as Freud would have it, form universal stages of infantile development, but rather continue to operate throughout a person's life, and what's more, function as the site from which the most heterogeneous aspects of subjectivity can develop. Remaining open to be addressed, and in their linkages with other semiological elements, to be transformed into new configurations of being, it is these affective components, I believe, that by operating simultaneously on the side of dissociates and on the side of the embodied person, that form the crux in any process of subjective becoming and potential unbecoming. By transcending, or rather invalidating, the traditional opposition between the incorporeal and the corporeal, and thus positing the embodied person as a material symbolic complex whose process of production is neither finishable nor binary, Guattari's multi-componential model of subjectivation furthermore suggests an inherently affective, collectively produced, and essentially changeable human ontology. His foregrounding of language and the mass media, as well as the incorporeal universes of reference as those relative to music and art in the process of self-creation or autopoiesis, sufficiently explains why he's able to ascribe to subjectivity, quote, a dimension of autonomy of an aesthetic order. His reluctant yet unmistakable privileging of these vectors of subjectivation as those from which its most creative moments may emerge additionally confirms that aesthetic practices play a structuring role in the process of becoming on its most profound affective levels. And since these levels maintain themselves in parallel throughout life, this insight into their structure